London. Weepy time down south. The last bachelor Beatle was no longer a bachelor. Paul McCartney married New Yorker Linda Eastman. He'd gone and been and done it at Marylebone Register Office.
Well, why did you wait so long before you got married?
I was thinking about it.
How did you get him? Thousands, millions of girls all over the world have been trying to get him for years. How did you get him?
No comment.
How did she get you?
Persuasion, you know, she was persuaded.
Just persuasion?
Yeah, gentle persuasion.
Although Linda McCartney occasionally ventured into the studio with the Beatles, she and Mary Hopkins sang harmonies on Let It Be. It wasn't until Paul's strictly solo McCartney album that her presence became musically significant. Released on April 17, 1970, the popular, largely homespun record showed that even on his own, Paul was still a force to be reckoned with. Despite his role in the extended dissolution of the Beatles, his solo effort, complete with album graphics and backing vocals by Linda, nevertheless reached a wide audience, curious to see what kind of magic an individual Beatle could conjure. Obviously, the commercial acceptance of the work was extremely important to Paul, who, now that his old group seemed almost certain to split forever, was naturally anxious about the future. Just to make sure everyone knew exactly where he stood, Peter Brown at Apple sent over a list of over 40 questions for him to answer regarding his decision to break away from the band. This, along with a blow-by-blow account of the making of McCartney, was then released to the world media, in the hope of softening the blow of the Beatles' final goodbye to the fervent fandom. The net effect, however, was to point the finger at Paul, as the originator of the Beatles' demise as a group. After the initial shock of the breakup and his searing estrangement from John, Paul picked up the pieces of his life and began to think about getting back to work.
And I was on my own for the first time. And I got the 4-track Studer in my living room. And just like this, kind of just started making up songs and stuff. And it was a very bare album, very, I like it actually, I like it as an album. But I took a few little risks. I didn't realize I was taking risks. I thought, again, I was just making an album, you know, like I still do. But listening to it now, it's very basic kind of album. Something like That Would Be Something I think it's very me, very basic little thing.
With no band and no great desire to rush out and start one, working with his new wife seemed the simplest and best alternative.
And I kind of think, well, God, you know, I'm not like at the retirement age yet. I can't just swan off to a desert island. Yeah, I've got to do something. So just the kind of depression of actually trying to think what I would do next, you know, and my self-esteem was what was the thing that I think the guys who get laid off, it's what they feel. You just plummet. You just get so depressed.
Did you?
Yeah,
really?
I mean, that was the worst moment other than my mother dying when I was 14. That was the kind of second worst moment in my life to that point. I mean, I didn't get up for a long time. I didn't shave for a long time. I drank a little. Hey, what the hell? Yo, let's go for it. We got time off, guys. Why shave? No one's coming round. I don't have to go out. Yeah. It took me quite a lot of time, and Linda was like a major help with that. She kind of lifted me back up, and I eventually started thinking, well, you know, maybe it's not the end of the world, but it took a couple of months. And the difficult thing for me that an ordinary guy being laid off would encounter was people like yourself would sort of say to me, once I was trying to make a return to the world, you know, and start doing interviews as kind of, you quote, your ex-Beatle. The worst question I really feared was they'd say, Paul, are you happy? And I go, yes.
I was either just going to kind of sit around and rest on my laurels for the rest of my life, or I was going to get out and start a new band and keep doing it. And we made that decision. We thought, well, we'll do it that way. And so it was just a kind of overnight thing. I asked Linda if she wanted to be in it, and she said, yeah, okay. I don't think quite realizing what she was getting into.
Paul just showed me middle C and said, you learn the rest. So I've learned chords, really.
We're outspoken, you're okay.
And don't try filming it, or you might get some trouble.
The McCartneys' first real joint effort was the heartfelt single, Another Day, issued on February 19, 1971. The story of a young girl lost in a maze of one-night stands and broken dreams, the song was a compassionate statement about the displaced and alienated in society. An auspicious start to Paul's solo career, the record reached all the way to the #1 spot on the British charts. Flying to New York in January for a visit with Linda's family, the couple decided to lay down some tracks for a new album. Auditions were secretly held in a dingy Manhattan rehearsal hall to try to find some local musical talent to play with them in supporting roles. One of those who came along to the invitation-only proceedings was New York session drummer Denny Seiwell. Seiwell remembers some third-rate equipment haphazardly set up in one corner, complemented by the absolutely shoddiest kit he had ever seen.
So they said, hey, do you mind playing for us? Yeah, okay. What do you want to hear? You got a bass or a guitar or something? He said, nah, just play. Play some rock and roll. I had my tom-toms with me from another date, and I set them up real quick, and I just went right into Ringo. You know, I was just having some fun. And I think it was the fact that I could play, and I also had a good attitude. I didn't give any guff about what was going on.
Much to the drummer's surprise, he was informed the next day that he had blitzed the other 8 percussionists invited to perform and was in. Paul recalls his reason for settling on the towering 6'2.5" native Pennsylvanian. Well, actually is his tom-toms. That may not sound like much to anyone who is not a musician, but if you see a drummer playing tom-toms, you learn a lot about him. With Seiwell in place, the McCartneys needed to locate a couple of top-flight guitarists, who soon presented themselves in the persons of David Spinoza and Hugh McCracken. Only 21 at the time of the audition, Spinoza was already a recording studio legend of sorts, turning pro at the age of just 17.
I thought I was sort of an unlikely candidate for this because I wasn't a Beatles aficionado in any way. And I then got a call from Linda McCartney saying, hi, I'm Linda McCartney, my husband's trying to put a band together. Would you come and meet us? I was like, wow, I thought it was a joke, but it really was Linda. So I went there, and there was Paul and Linda in this loft. This was like this really dusty loft and dank. And he asked me if I could play a certain rhythm on the guitar, and he handed me an acoustic guitar. So I said, sure, The whole thing was surreal. I was, wow, in this room with Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney.
Booking time at Phil Ramone's A&R Studios, the totally unrehearsed quintet charged ahead, recording no less than 21 of Paul and Linda's new tunes. According to reports, the session started out smoothly enough, but soon ran into difficulty when the McCartneys began spacing out on the day-to-day business of organizing and overseeing the dates. Spinoza recalls, I told them I couldn't keep every week open because when McCartney goes back to England, there are other people that call me, and they are going to keep me eating, not him. Although I'd love to do his sessions. I said I could make 2 of the days, but not all 5. And Linda got very indignant. I got vibrations like, it's Paul McCartney's session. You're supposed to keep your life open indefinitely. She really speaks for him and handles all the business. She wouldn't let me talk directly to sort out what he wanted.
Well, Paul was a little more meticulous about sound. Paul was really into the engineering of records. He's really brilliant about getting drum sounds and different sounds for each song. And he tailored the sound for each song. Once we did a song, he would get a completely different drum sound for the next song, a completely different bass sound. He was really into the sonics of music.
Musically, Spinoza felt right at home playing with the creative and orderly Paul, but complained that his well-known penchant for perpetually trying to push the river did tend to make the others feel rather like second-class citizens. It is a charge that has been leveled against the sometimes annoyingly perfectionistic musician since his early days in Liverpool. I think the whole album was done in the same format as the McCartney album, says Spinoza. Only we played the parts for him. There was no freedom. We were told exactly what to play. Paul sang us the parts he wanted, and the tune developed as we went along. We made suggestions, but he rarely took them. And if he did, always modified it into a Paul McCartney-sounding thing. For David Spinoza, perhaps the least attractive feature of playing with Paul was the nearly constant presence of Linda, who, apart from being Paul's wife, didn't seem to have a very productive reason for being around at all. Linda didn't have much to do in the studio. She just took care of the kids. They brought the whole family every day to the studio. If he was there until 4 a.m, everybody stayed. I thought to a certain degree it was distracting. I don't know what Linda did in the studio apart from sit there and make comments on what she thought was good and bad. I mean, she can sing fine, like any girl that worked in a high school glee club. In the end, Spinoza was politely let go by Linda, who rang him up one evening and told him not to bother coming in the next day, as they were doing some last-minute vocal overdubs, and he wouldn't be needed. He half expected them to phone in a few days and invite him back, but the call never came. His thinly veiled disapproval of Mrs. McCartney perhaps a little more obvious than he'd imagined.
No, I actually didn't play anymore after that. We sort of had a falling out. I had a little bit of a fall. Actually, not with him. I had a little falling out with Linda, and it just didn't work out.
Still, Spinoza was happy to have been part of the sessions, and remembers the experience today with mixed emotions. Working with Paul was fun, in as much as it was good to see how he works and where he's coming from. But as a musician, there was no challenge. McCartney is definitely a songwriter, not a musician, but he composes beautiful tunes. In the studio, he's incredibly prompt and businesslike. No smoking pot, no drinks or carrying on, nothing. Just straight ahead. He came in at 9 every morning. We'd listen to what we'd just done the day before, and then it was 8 hours of just playing. He's not a very loose cat. He just wants to make good music. The arduous, extended sessions eventually reached the public as Ram, one of Paul's most innovative and original works. Altogether, 6 tracks were credited to Paul and Linda McCartney, and 6 solely to Paul. Unfortunately, bigwigs over at the Beatles' old publishing house, Northern Songs, and Sir Lou Grade of ATV found it difficult to accept that the musically untrained and unaccomplished Linda should be listed as a co-composer alongside the great Paul McCartney, and on that basis, slapped the couple with a whopping $1 million lawsuit in defense of their interests in the former Beatles publishing. As it stood, on those 6 tracks, Linda was entitled to collect half the writer's royalties, which normally would have gone entirely to Paul to be shared with his publisher. Mrs. McCartney, however, was not one of Northern's clients, and therefore that little bit of flesh would have been denied to them, an intolerable prospect for the already well-fed corporate conglomerate. Paul explains, "I said, well, look, if my wife is actually saying, change that, or I like that better than that, then I'm using her as a collaborator. I mean, John never had any input on The Long and Winding Road, and Yoko still collects royalties on it. You gotta flow with these things." The joke at the time was that Linda was the only one getting paid in our household, because we were all held up with Apple being subject to litigation. I wasn't seeing any money. Every businessman I had ever known was suing me. I felt, I'm damned if she's not going to get paid for it. I'll put in a bill for her services. They weren't major checks, but it was the only money we were seeing because she was the only one free of all the contracts in our house. With no wish to further legally entangle himself, Paul agreed to film a television special for ATV in exchange for their dropping the suit. Additionally, Linda would get to keep her royalties. Released in Great Britain on May 21st, 1971, Ram was not the hit Paul felt he needed in the face of the flack he had been subjected to for initiating the disbanding of the Beatles. Critics were particularly harsh. Writing for Rolling Stone, John Landau famously lambasted the album as incredibly inconsequential, and accused Paul of inserting himself into a fantasy world. Others derided the record as lightweight and self-indulgent, a retreat from the cultural gravity of the Beatles' final works. For Paul, it was a dispiriting blow. He had poured himself into Ram, not only as a songwriter but as a producer, crafting its layered arrangements alongside Linda. The biting track Too Many People didn't go unnoticed by John, who took offense at what he perceived as veiled jabs at himself and Yoko. He said too many people preaching practices, John recalled later. That was a little dig at me. Paul admitted years later, I was looking at my fellow Beatles and getting hurt and annoyed by what I felt was their attitude towards me, so I wrote Ram to get it off my chest. I did feel that certain people were getting a bit preachy, you should do this. I felt that was a bit much. He clarified that the song wasn't entirely about John, but parts of it were, what he called a little dig.
Thing is, so much of what they held to be truth was war is over. Well, no, it isn't. But I get what you're saying. War is over if you want it to be. So if enough people want war to be over, it'll be over? I'm not sure that's entirely true, but it's a great sentiment.
Paul's grievances with the other Beatles, particularly John and George, were all over Ram, even if they were buried between sun-drenched harmonies and playful melodies. On the surface, it sounded like a lighthearted album, but underneath the surface, there was tension, sarcasm, and frustration. The lyric, "You took your lucky break and broke it in two," also seemed pointed. While Paul insisted it could be applied more broadly, John took it personally and responded in kind. That same year, John fired back with "How Do You Sleep" on his Imagine album. The venom was unmistakable. It was a brutal retaliation. Paul was stunned by the intensity of John's attack, especially given how raw their relationship already was.
John actually had Alan Klein and Yoko in the room, suggesting lyrics during writing sessions. In his song How Do You Sleep, the line, "The only thing you did was yesterday," was apparently Alan Klein's suggestion. And John said, "Hey, great, put that in." I could see the laughs they had doing it, and I had to work very hard not to take it too seriously. But at the back of my mind, I was thinking, wait a minute, all I ever did was yesterday? I suppose that's a funny pun, but all I ever did was yesterday, Let It Be, The Long and Winding Road, Ellen Rigby, Lady Madonna. F*** you, John.
The song featured George on slide guitar, adding salt to the wound. Paul now felt ganged up on by two of his former bandmates. But Paul wasn't entirely innocent in the feud. Even songs like Three Legs on Ram seemed to allude to the fractured Beatles dynamic. "When I thought you was my friend, but you let me down, put my heart around the bend." Many interpreted the three legs metaphor as a reference to the other three Beatles abandoning him, or conspiring against him during the band's messy breakup and legal wranglings. In fact, Paul had been increasingly frustrated by the way he was portrayed in the press and by others. He'd resisted the idea of manager Alan Klein taking control of the Beatles' business affairs, instead of proposing his father-in-law Lee Eastman. And Paul eventually sued the band just to extricate himself from the legal partnership, a move that made him appear as the villain in the public eye. With Ram, Paul tried to reclaim the narrative, albeit in an oblique and artful way. The album's homemade aesthetic and domestic themes were both a retreat and a rebuke. He had left the chaos of Apple and the courtroom behind, and was now focused on building a new life with Linda. This time, however, he figured it would work out better if he took the plunge and formed his own group, something that had been in the offing for some time. Originally, he had wanted to call his new band Turpentine, but was subsequently talked out of the idea by an indignant fan. Then it was the Dazzlers, but that too was dropped at the last minute in favor of the more commercially viable Wings. According to popular legend, the inspiration behind the name came to Paul as he silently prayed for the safe arrival of his second daughter, Stella, asking that the child be delivered on the wings of an angel.
There was some complications with Stella. With you, it had been very easy, birth and everything. With Stella, it was such a touch-and-go thing. It was a little bit of a drama. And so when the baby came along, I think I'd been rather thankful for the whole thing, and I was imagining, I seem to remember one day sort of imagining sort of angels' wings and things like that. And I thought, wow, that's a nice image, wings.
As for the group's lineup, Paul immediately settled on Denny Sywell as his drummer, ringing the good-natured American with the news from his farm in Scotland. Sywell, honored to have been remembered thus by the great Beatle, hopped on a plane with his wife, Monique, and within hours was sitting down to dinner with the McCartneys at High Park. Next came the matter of choosing a suitably inventive rhythm guitarist. The insubordinate David Spinoza was definitely out, despite his virtuoso performances, and Paul was casting about, attempting to put a face to his vision of the flash, good-looking player he was hoping for. He finally hit upon his old friend Denny Lane. "It's one of those things when you're starting a band," says Paul. "Several ideas go through your head. Different names are suggested to you, and then I remembered Go Now. That was the single Denny made with the Moody Blues, and it's always been one of my favorite records." Although during the mid to late 60s, Paul and Denny had been good mates, by the end of Paul's frantic Jane Asher days, the two had all but lost touch. Linda, too, apparently, was keen on the inclusion of the laid-back Lane, later admitting to several journalists that he had been a big favorite of hers when he sang lead for the Birmingham-based Moody's. Typically, Lane was unruffled, sleeping on an old mattress in the back room of his then-manager Tony Secunda's Mayfair office. He wasn't even sure to whom he was speaking when the telephone call first came through. "Paul who?" he barked into the receiver, not especially thrilled at rising prior to his customary 1 o'clock wake-up from Secunda. "McCartney, you daft sod. How are you, mate?" "I'm okay. Jesus. Listen, sorry about the mix-up. I had a bit of a late night. It's great you called, though. So what's up?" "I'm forming a new band to go out on the road," Paul explained. "Are you interested?" "Too right I am," said Lane. "When do we start?" Lane caught a late flight to Glasgow and was met at the airport by Denny Sywell, who joined him on the brief 20-minute run up to Campbelltown, the nearest airfield to the McCartney's sprawling Kintyre farm. "I was amazed he was living in the back of Beyond in a very small farmhouse he'd only just started to work on," remembers Lane. "I like the fact that we could go and live that sort of lifestyle and still get things done."
And we kind of just jammed along to old songs that we were brought up on, Buddy Holly, Elvis, and that came really easily because we were all versed in that stuff. And it was fun. That's the main thing about it. It was fun, it wasn't pressure.
Asked to recall his first impressions of Linda, Lane patiently explained that he always liked the earthy blonde and therefore wasn't surprised to see her as an unaffected young mother, preparing a late dinner in the tiny kitchen for her hungry tribe. Linda was doing some cooking, I remember, and said she admired my work in the Moody's. She'd heard a Coca-Cola ad we'd done that she thought was pretty original. I got on with Linda all the way through Wings. Although at first the plan for the new band was a typical male macho lineup, Paul later suggested that the musically inexperienced Linda come in on keyboards. Like Stuart Sutcliffe joining the Beatles to play bass without benefit of any prior musical expertise, Linda similarly became a member of Wings with nothing to fall back on except her immense desire to please her husband and the keen, competitive spirit of the upwardly mobile Eastmans. The main reason she was there, says Lane, was she was Paul's wife and they wanted to be together. I always resented it because I thought we could have been a better band a lot quicker if we had found a proper keyboard player. Not that I minded Linda being around, but as a musician, I wasn't too keen on the idea. Lane recalls that Linda actually agreed with him concerning her new role in the group. She never wanted to be in Wings. I think she would have liked to have been a part of it, yes, but as a photographer. She certainly wasn't an idiot by any shake of the stick, though. She reminded me a bit of John Lennon. She had that same kind of attitude. If she believed something, nobody was going to change her. After a couple of hard-rocking days together on the farm, Paul's ragtag Wings flew to London and cloistered themselves at Abbey Road to begin recording their premiere album together, Wildlife, originally intended as a concept album with the faster tracks collected together for dancing on side 1, and the slower, supposedly sexier numbers for necking, said their first tour program, snuggled up on the other side. Produced by Paul and engineered by the soon-to-be famous Alan Parsons, the album also contained what Paul later termed his least favorite tune of all time, the innocuous Bip Bop. "It just goes nowhere," he later commented. "I still cringe every time I hear it." Working at lightning speed, the fledgling group laid down the basic tracks within days, interrupted only by the cesarean birth of little Stella Nina McCartney on September 13, 1971, at London's King's College Hospital. In all, Wildlife was made in just over 2 weeks from start to finish, and was previewed to the eagerly waiting media on November 8th at a gala party held at the Mecca Ballroom in Leicester Square. Among the pop luminaries in attendance at the Buy Your Own Drink extravaganza were Keith Moon, Sandy Denny, Mary Hopkin, Terence Stamp, The Faces, Jimmy Page, Deep Purple, John Entwistle, Elton John, Mungo Jerry, Gilbert O'Sullivan, and Sandy Shaw. dancing to the big band sounds of Ray McVeigh's orchestra, the 1,000 plus invited guests, thrilled to the spirited display of formation dancing, and boogied the night away until 3 a.m. Sadly, like the flamboyant Ram, the Barebones album was generally very poorly received, inching its way up to number 11 in Britain and only a notch higher in the US. For the first time in his career, Paul was forced to allow that not everything he touched automatically turned to gold. Wildlife is another album we could have done better, said Linda in 1976. Some of the songs are very good, but we only did it in about a week. It's funny, the band was so new, but we didn't take care. It wasn't really a group when we did Wildlife. The album's Back to Nature front cover, although striking, was completely devoid of any word of just who this faraway band of hippie musicians really was, further contributing to the record's dismal sales. Eventually, a small green and gold sticker was affixed to the front jacket. It simply said, "Wings Wildlife," and did little either to promote the band or salvage the record.
I used to really think Wildlife was a kind of, oh no, we really shouldn't have done that one, because that was definitely an attempt to just leap in the studio. That kind of arose out of one single factor that we'd heard that Dylan had made an album in a week. He'd just run in and he'd finished it. And I kind of thought, yeah, that's where it's at that time. So we'll run in and we'll do one in about a week or so. We went in, it was done very quickly. Didn't do that well. Not that that worries me, because, you know, when you've had a lot of success, it's not too bad having some that aren't big successes, because you kind of think, well, you know,
it's a nice luxury.
It's all right, yeah, it's nice. It kind of pads out the sort of the other sides of your image rather than just all the time success. So I didn't mind it, but I wasn't that up on it. Till one day I was going down Sunset Strip, and there was this camper pulled up in the traffic lights, and some guy, just a longer guy, kind of just pulled out Wildlife. He just had a copy of it, and he just said, "I'm going up in the mountains, man, and I'm taking this." I said, "Yeah, it's the best album you've ever made, man." And that was one guy's opinion, you know. And so that's like what happens with me in my albums. I can never tell when they're right out.
Yeah.
The minute they're right out, I'm hopeless. I'm totally confused, because I've listened to record business people telling me what's the single. I've listened to people telling me that I should change this or do that, and I'm totally confused by the time an album's out. It takes a few months after, and I start to warm to it, start to hear somebody playing it at a party, and often, like, things that have happened with me is like I hear a sound kind of in the next room, and I think, oh, and I get jealous. I think, oh my God, who's that, you know? And I go into the room, and it's us. I think, oh, I like this group. We're all right after all, you know, because everyone's like a bit paranoid.
Following the release of Wildlife, Paul and Linda jetted off to Jamaica for a short holiday, eventually linking up with the two Denny's, Lane and Sywell, in New York for a bit of promotion, plus a fair amount of rehearsal in the same West 40s rat hole where the first faint echoes of the band were born. In addition, they laid down an as-of-yet unreleased instrumental blues track in anticipation of one day using it as a B-side to a possible maxi single. After the inevitable Mad McCartney Christmas rush, the group finally got down to some serious rock and roll first thing in the new year, with daily rehearsals in London aimed at pulling together material for both a New Wings LP and a concert tour planned for some time in 1972. Initially, Paul had envisioned Wings as strictly a four-piece unit, but changed his mind and added Denny Lane's old mate, Irish guitarist Henry Campbell Lycan McCullough, on lead guitar. By the time he joined Wings in January of 1972, McCullough was an almost legendary figure back home in County Derry, having worked a number of Irish show bands before joining the popular Dublin group Gene and the Gents, fronted by a black South African lead singer. He then played with the innovative Area Parent, later discovered and groomed by Jimi Hendrix's mentor, Chaz Chandler. Thereafter, McCullough drifted through a succession of hard-rocking bands, including Sweeney's Men and the Grease Band. He remembers being called up for service in Paul's Wings. In fact, it was Paul's roadie who rang, saying, "Do you fancy sitting in?" After the Grease Band, I didn't know what the hell was going on, so I went down and had a play. That was Tuesday, and afterwards things were left at that. Nothing was said. Then I had another call on Thursday to go down again, and afterwards Paul said, "Do you want to join our group?" Although I knew Lane, I'd never met McCartney before. Once I got used to seeing him there in person, he turned out to be a great bloke. The first track utilizing McCullough's top-flight talents, and incidentally, the first Wings single, was the controversial tune, at least amongst the English, Give Ireland Back to the Irish, released in Britain on February 25, 1972. Banned by the conservative BBC as being a bit too far left, this thumping anti-English ballad nevertheless gave Paul something he had secretly coveted all his life: instant disrespectability. Having written a direct response to the terrible Bloody Sunday massacre in Northern Ireland that January, the song allowed Paul to feel every bit as heavy and potentially radical as John, at least for a while. Our soldiers, my country's army, had gone in and killed some people, says Paul. And I'd grown up with this thing that the Irish are great, they're our mates, our brothers. We used to joke that Liverpool was the capital of Ireland. Suddenly we're killing our buddies, and I thought, wait a minute, this is not clever, and I wish to protest on behalf of the people. I did that song and was rung up by a lot of people who said, please don't release this, we don't need this right now. And I said, yes we do, gotta have it. Despite Paul's late-blooming crusading, however, the Backwater Skiffle tune failed to impress just about everyone other than the uptight Auntie BBC, and fell to earth with a resounding thud, like so many other of Paul's immediate post-Beatles releases. Denny Lane remembers, Paul was quite innocently trying to solve a problem which obviously can't be solved with a song. A lot of Irish people took umbrage at it, which was a bit frightening. As a result, we did get a lot of picketing at gigs. At one point, I had to put my toe down and drive through some people, forcing them to jump out of the way to get us out. I think Henry's brother was beaten up in Southern Ireland because of it. It's very difficult when you're writing songs not to be controversial sometimes. You're obviously going to upset someone, but that's one instance I'm not particularly happy about, or wasn't at the time, certainly. The next great chapter in the life of Wings commander McCartney was his impromptu university tour of Great Britain, commencing on February 8, 1972.
We're going back to square one, so we won't book a big tour, we won't even book hotels. We'll just go in a van with the band, the kids, the dogs. We'll all just take off up the motorway and we'll find somewhere to play.
We're used to it, actually, because we travel around a lot with the kids and the dogs.
For instance, today when we leave here, we'll just get in the van and we'll pick up a map.
We didn't tell the press, we just went off on this secret tour. We drove north up the M1 until we got near Nottingham, a place called Ashby de la Zouche. We said, that sounds pretty good. Let's see if there's a university around here and ask some students if they want us to play for them at all. The nearest university was Nottingham University. Our roadie went out and he said, hey, we've got Paul McCartney in the band, do you want him to play for you tonight? The head of the students' union was confused and dazed, but he took one look at me, he said, oh, yeah, all right. So that was what we did, the first gig on our university tour.
And we've been doing that ever since. We've been to York, Hull, Newcastle, Sheffield last night. It was just great.
We were at Newcastle City Hall. We like to do something like wildlife. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. Just silence. I looked around, and then it's going. It's like, I've forgotten the chords. So I go over, I walk over, and then I go, and I can't remember the bloody things. I'm going, well, this time the audience is rolling. They're loving it. And then suddenly she remembered it. 1, 2, 3, dang, we went into it. The heart was beating fast. We had quite a few moments like that. The tour was full of sheer panic, but it meant that there was a good camaraderie, and it was building the relationships between all the people in the band, and ready for our next step, which was Europe.
For 2 weeks, the band crisscrossed the country, splitting up their meager earnings in cash at the end of every evening, just like the Beatles had done 1,000 lifetimes before. Wings played their final gig of the tour on February 17th at Swansea in Wales. Originally, they had planned another full week, but even this novel approach to performing was beginning to wear a bit thin. It was tiring being on the road 24 hours a day, recalls McCullough. Still, Paul had realized a 12-year ambition to get back out on the road, minus all the hassles that travel hand in hand with being a big star. It's tempting to speculate how things might have worked out if it had been the Beatles crammed into the back of that van and not Wings. Paul too must have at least considered it. Of course, he wasn't talking. That was then, he would often say to people around him. He must have wondered if things would ever be the same.
I'll tell you, that wasn't brought up at all. We did not talk about the past. The Beatles were never talked about. There was nothing of that. I mean, it was really just, let's go to work. And every day was the excitement of coming to work. And Paul would just break out a guitar or a piano, and he'd sing the song we were going to do that day. And, you know, each song was better than the day before. And you just went about the task at hand.
Wings' second single, an only slightly rearranged version of Mary Had a Little Lamb, brought down yet another hail of ruthless criticism on Paul, who, quite reasonably, after 10 years plus of catering exclusively to the young adult market, only wanted to put out a tune children might enjoy. As far back as '68, he had wanted the Beatles to do something specifically for children, originally considering a full-length feature based on Alfred Bestal's well-loved character, Rupert the Bear. That particular project unfortunately never quite came off, although Paul and Linda did manage one trailer-length cartoon, Rupert Bear and Frog Song, later released in conjunction with Give My Regards to Broad Street in 1984. All things considered, the critical reaction to Mary Had a Little Lamb was not only grossly unfair, but typical of much of the self-righteous, quasi-intellectual claptrap masquerading as critical journalism both then and now.
Yeah. You know, nearly everything I've ever done or been involved in has had some of that negative critical reaction. You'd think that something like She Loves You with the Beatles would be pretty positive, the reaction to that, but it wasn't. The very first week out, that was like supposed to be the worst song the Beatles had ever thought of doing. So through my experience, like, you know, I've always had that. Ram was supposed to be the worst thing ever.
Happily, the quaint, infectious little tune sold well, eventually working its way up the charts to a very respectable number 6. Now reasonably well-knit as a band, Wings hit the road again in July of '72, this time heading out on a gaily appointed, open-top London double-decker bus, bound for the outdoor festivals and opera halls of the continent. Their first gig at the Centre Culturel in Château Vallon in France on Sunday, July 9th, went down brilliantly. Everyone was in exceptionally fine form, breezing through a rapid-fire succession of several rare, heretofore unreleased Wings tracks, including I Would Only Smile, Henry's Blue, 1882, Mama's Little Girl, and Best Friend, as well as Denny Lane's classic Say You Don't Mind.
There's kind of, between me and Paul, there was always that competition, a friendly competition still, you know. Can you come up with something, or can I come up with something? Yeah, try and beat, you know. We did that in Nashville, where he wrote one country song and he said, why don't you write one, we'll see what comes out the best, that kind of thing. You know, you're kind of kicking each other, you know, to do something, which is good, it's healthy.
The first major unpleasantness of the 26-city, 10-country tour happened on August 10th in Gothenburg, Sweden, when police intercepted a parcel of 7 ounces of dope addressed to Denny Sywell at the hotel and swooped down upon the McCartneys, Sywell, and the Wings' traveling secretary, Rebecca Hines, immediately following the last note of their gig at the Scandinavian Hall. Boldly switching off the band's sound system, the Swedish cops sternly requested the presence of the alleged ringleaders down at the local jail, where they were relentlessly badgered and harangued until they finally confessed to the deed. We told them we had found the cannabis in a letter, commented a police official. At first, they said they knew nothing about it, but after we questioned them for about 3 hours, they told the truth. McCartney, his wife, and Sywell told us they smoked hash every day. They said they were almost addicted to it. They said they had made arrangements to have the drugs posted to them each day they played in different countries, so they wouldn't have to take anything through customs themselves. Fortunately, local prosecutor Leonard Angelin, not wishing to bring down the wrath of the world's youth upon his peaceful little country, chose not to press for further charges in exchange for the McCartneys paying a reasonably hefty $1,000 fine. Despite Paul and Linda's indignation at being brought to task over their passion for smoking cannabis, the fun-loving couple would go on to face similar charges 5 times over the next 18 years, all in the name of having a quiet talk with friends to help shake off the pressures of life at the top.
As he left the court, McCartney, who'd been given 2 weeks to pay the fine, said, "The judge is a great guy."
Well, I'm glad to have got off like this, I'm glad it wasn't jail.
Did you think at one point it might have been?
I thought it might be, but I would have been okay as long as I could take my guitar in with me, write a few new songs and stuff, but I wasn't looking forward to it.
After the humiliation of his first arrest, the Wings gang were committed to never getting popped for anything again. It's not that anyone quit smoking dope. From that point on, everyone was just more careful. That's all. There were other difficult times, too, on Wings' first full-blown outing as a functioning touring band. One particularly disturbing incident happened in Sweden, when a young man walked up to Paul and Linda in a basement nightclub and calmly threatened to blow the superstar away with a revolver he claimed to have tucked away in his coat. Paul sat frozen with fear as the youth slowly walked to the other side of the club and leaned up against the bar, all while grinning menacingly. 5 minutes later, in walked Lane and McCullough, who sidled up to the couple in high spirits, ready for a good night out. "So, what's happening, kids?" asked Denny as he signaled one of the waiters for a drink. "Some guys just said he's got a gun and he's gonna shoot me," Paul whispered. Without a moment's hesitation, McCullough silently pulled a long, thin knife from inside his boot, hiding it carefully in his lap. "Where?" asked the veteran Dublin brawler. "The guy at the bar in the green suit coat," Paul answered. "But don't look." "Leave it to us, mate," said Henry, soundlessly slipping out of his seat while Denny went around the other way, joining up on either side of the leering would-be assassin. "Got a problem, lad?" McCullough asked, sitting down next to him on an adjacent stool. "No. Why?" said the kid, suddenly quite meek and mild. Seconds later, the two guitarists had him securely on the floor, searching his pockets for any sign of a weapon. "Okay, leave off!" the obviously off-balance fan bellowed. "You're hurting me. I didn't mean anything by it. I swear. It was just a joke, that's all." "Some joke, you wanker," Lane growled angrily, violently grabbing him by the hair for one last scathing tirade. "Clear off now before my friend here loses his patience and puts the boot in. Understand?" Not even stopping to brush away the slime on his clothes from the bottom of the bar, the pimply-faced punk ran for the door. 10 minutes or so later, the 4 musicians quietly left the night spot and returned to the security of their hotel, Paul badly shaken by the experience. Finished with touring for a while, Wings retreated into the studio where they churned out the paralyzing rocker Hi Hi Hi, released during the latter half of '72. Once again, the uptight BBC took offense and promptly banned the record, this time citing what they termed the inappropriate lyrical content of the rousing celebration of youthful sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Paul explains, "There was controversy over a supposed phrase in the song, body gun, but in actual fact I had used a real mad word from a surrealist play by a man called Alfred Jarry. He was a real nutter who used to cycle around Paris on his bike, and had this thing called the Pataphysical Society. It was nothing but a drinking club, but a professor of pataphysics sounds great. I used the term in Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Jarry wrote this theater sketch, which has this character, Ubu, who's always going around worried about his polyhedron. So I put in a line where I said, lie on the bed and get ready for my blank. I wondered what I should put here, so I said, polygon. The people taking down the lyrics for us thought I said body gun, which I thought was better. And that's the basis the song got banned on. Fortunately, the prurient British Broadcasting Company did little to affect either the popularity or the sales of the high-energy 45, which clocked in at number 10 on the American Billboard chart. Holed up at Abbey Road, Morgan, and Olympic Studios with his band, Paul laid down some of his most enduring post-Beatles work during this period, including the explosive theme to the James Bond sleeper, Live and Let Die, as well as the romantic My Love. Much of the material culled from these sessions eventually appeared on Red Rose Speedway. Although he originally intended it as a double album, Paul eventually abandoned the idea in favor of coming out as strong as possible after the relative commercial failure of both Ram and Wildlife. Denny Laine remembers there being considerable tension in the air during the sessions because Paul and secondary producer Glyn Johns often failed to see eye to eye on the project's often complicated musical issues. He and Paul didn't hit it off at all, says Laine. Paul always likes to be his own producer anyway, but at least if he's going to bring one in, they've got to be able to see Paul's point of view. I could understand him, but when he's trying to come up with new sounds, you might get a producer set in his ways who will not accept that this crazy new idea is ever going to work. That's what happened with Glyn. As a result, though, we did experiment a lot more. We would try for different sounds, going into funny little rooms to get weird guitar noises and stuff. In some ways, the fact that they were in competition actually helped the album. Issued in Great Britain on May 3, 1973, the brilliantly packaged LP climbed only as high as number 4 in the UK, yet did manage a short stint at the top of the charts in the US. Having decided that a British tour was in order to bolster the release of Red Rose Speedway, Paul and Wings set out on a bus to Bristol on May 11th. Opening up for the band was Brinsley Schwarz, a cult group with a small but loyal following, often seen on the London pub circuit. Nick Lowe, then playing bass with the group, remembers his first impressions of the magnificent McCartney. There was always this veil in front of him. You got the impression that he was thinking about something else to what he was telling you. And whatever happens, he's having a nice day all the time. If any nastiness crops up, it's like he never sees it. I don't think this veil was anything to do with smoking pot, although he did seem to smoke it pretty much all the time. Lowe, who was great friends with Henry McCullough, remembers that McCullough was often very rude to Linda in front of everyone, which certainly didn't bode well for his longevity with the group. In addition, the high-living Irishman actually vomited on stage once during the taping of a promotional clip for My Love on Top of the Pops. Strike 2. Altogether, Wings blitzed 12 cities during the brief 2-week tour, playing an additional 4 dates early in July. Quite apart from Paul's various musical endeavors, 1973 saw him involved in work on several film projects. The first, a partially animated documentary tentatively entitled The Bruce McMouse Show, was to chronicle Wings' first European tour from the point of view of a tiny mouse who lived underneath the stage with his wife, Yvonne, and their kids, Soily, Swoony, and Swat. The film that many people did see, of course, was his exuberant James Paul McCartney special, first airing on American television on April 16, 1973. Despite generally poor reviews, the hour-long program neatly showcased Paul's varied musical talents. It was capped by a rollicking Wings multi-concert finale. Called Overblown and Silly by Britain's Melody Maker, the eclectic special was defended by Paul in a series of interviews in which he discussed his decision to act out his often clearly middle-of-the-road fantasies. You could say it's fulfilling an old ambition, he told reporters. Right at the start, I fancied myself involved in musical comedy, but that was before the Beatles. And don't get me wrong, I'm no Astaire or Gene Kelly, and this doesn't mean the start of something big. I don't want to be an all-rounder. I'm sticking to what I am. Wings was definitely Paul McCartney's band. Whatever Paul wanted, he got. The feelings and opinions of those around him were largely incidental, especially when it came to allowing his bandmates to express themselves creatively.
My credentials were that I'd been in a semi-famous band anyway, who went on to be more famous after, but at that time. So it was Paul, really, was the centre of attention. And, you know, he was like too famous almost to go on the road too much. It was kind of his ideas, bouncing them off me, and then me coming up with bits to add to them, you know. Eventually he would say to me, have you got any songs? Have you got any ideas? And then we would take my ideas and he would add to them. He was always trying to incorporate the rest of the band into more of a, you know, leader position, you know. But because of the focus on him all the time and the pressure on him, I suppose he couldn't help but, you know, coming up with new ideas all the time.
Sometimes, however, people with a bit of spunk would beat him to the punch and tell him to get lost. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it inevitably left the egocentric composer dumbfounded. A case in point was Henry McCullough's departure from the band while rehearsing at the McCartney's farm in July of '73. Always skeptical about Linda's inclusion in the group, Henry apparently drew the line when the heavy-handed Paul tried to tell him how to play the guitar. After tossing a ball back and forth for a few minutes, Henry calmly laid down his guitar, switched off his amp, and called to his wife. "Shayla, that's it. Get the car and start packing. We're getting out of here." Storming out of the barn, never to return, McCullough had asserted his artistic integrity before the McCartneys in a way few others had dared. A fairly heroic stance for what was basically a relative unknown. Of the many musicians Paul has courted over the years, it is interesting to note that the vast majority have ended up taking a walk after bottoming out on his oppressive attitude, not to mention the ever-critical eye of wife Linda. As far as Lane is concerned, McCullough was most likely looking for an excuse to bail out after having gone as far as he felt he could with Paul's mainstream music.
Henry, again, wanted to go off and do his own thing. You know, he came from a different background to that. He was more of a, well, Joe Cocker's Grease Band. He was more of a blueser, and he liked all that sort of blues clubs and all that stuff was him, you know. The big time on the road, all that thing, wasn't really Henry, to be honest.
Ringing up a few days later, Henry confirmed that he was indeed leaving for good, which reportedly quite upset Paul. Eager to go off and record their next album in some exotic locale, Paul eventually settled on Lagos, Nigeria, where EMI had their own studio. Now that McCullough was gone, however, he and Denny would have to try and take up the slack on guitar, a prospect Paul secretly found exciting. As the days slipped by, he grew increasingly keen about the African trip. "Think about all the wild rhythms and things they've got going over there," he would say to his mate Denny. "We're gonna have the time of our lives. You wait." On August 9th, 1973, as Wings was about to leave for Lagos, Denny Sywell called to say he didn't really feel like going to Africa and was quitting the band.
And like I say, Denny was more of a session guy, studio, and which he gave up to be in a band, basically. You know, that whole session people are another breed, you know. They just play on everything. They're all very, very good players, and they're capable of doing something bang, bang, bang. Being in a band is a different story. Being in a band is a lot harder. It's a 24-hour job. So he was kind of, I think he'd had enough of that for a while, you know, touring around. Plus I think he had a bit of a bad back or something, but traveling and, you know, it wasn't getting on.
Now that Wings was unexpectedly reduced to a trio, the challenge of making a successful album was significantly greater. Still, if Paul and Denny were forced to get by without a proper lead guitarist, then they would also somehow muddle through sans the drummer. Always a passable percussionist, Paul decided to pick up the sticks himself, and to the surprise of many, did just fine.
And I've played a lot of stuff myself. I played the drums myself, the bass myself, a lot of guitar with Denny, did a lot of the vocals myself, and I took a lot of control on that album. So it was almost a solo album.
From the moment the aeronautical trio touched down in Africa, things went wrong. For one thing, it was still the tail end of the monsoon season, and the place was awash in a rolling river of mud. It was also crawling with bugs, which petrified their insectophobic engineer, old Beatles ally, Geoff Emerick. Apart from many mundane inconveniences, however, there were many very real threats. One day, while the band was busy laying down some bed tracks in the studio, Paul suddenly crashed up against the mixing console, unable to breathe. Grabbing at his throat, he fought to suck down even the tiniest bit of air. Rushing to his side, Linda and Denny were convinced the 32-year-old singer was having a serious heart attack. When he passed out moments later, Linda ran screaming for a doctor. After regaining consciousness, Paul was sure death was imminent. Linda, Lane, and a local physician tried their best to calm him. He was later diagnosed as having had an acute bronchial spasm, probably brought on by his heavy smoking. He spent the next few days recovering at Ikeja, near the airport, in one of the houses rented for the band. Scarier still was the night that Paul and Linda were accosted by a gang of knife-wielding hoods on a dark Lagos street. The McCartneys had been walking on the sidewalk when a decrepit car containing 5 youths pulled up alongside and started to follow them. At first, they were not particularly alarmed. Starstruck locals often spotted them. Pulling up to the curb, the 5 thugs jumped out of the car and swarmed around them. "Don't kill us, please," Linda screamed through a torrent of tears. "We're musicians, you know. He's Beatle Paul." Paul glanced over at Linda, who was tight against the wall with a very nasty blade pressed hard against her throat. "Give it up, bastards," one of the more menacing shouted. "Okay, fine, take the lot," shouted McCartney. "Just don't hurt us, that's all. We don't care about the money." Grabbing everything of value the rich white couple were carrying, the thieves made off with not only their jewelry and cash, but also 2 of Linda's favorite cameras and, most upsetting of all, the cassette demos of the songs for the new album. Attempting to compose themselves, Paul and Linda cautiously made their way to the nearby studio where the staff summoned the police. "It's a lucky thing you're both white," one of the constables confided as the couple nursed drinks aptly provided by Denny. "Otherwise, they would have surely cut your throats. You see, they know that to you all, blacks look alike, so they don't fear being identified. Here the penalty for such a crime is execution, so they had nothing to lose by killing you. You are very lucky people." Lane elaborates on the incident. He was warned about going out after dark. You see, it's a military setup over there, so when they finally catch the guys, they just take them down to the beach, tie them to a pole, and shoot them publicly. Anyway, Paul just thought, well, we don't listen to things like that. And they set out on foot over to my place. It could have been extremely nasty. In the studio too, there were problems. Half the stuff was just hanging out of the walls, says Lane. Nobody knew where to plug it in. We'd give a guy $20 to go out and get a pack of cigarettes, and he'd come back with no change. Ginger Baker was always trying to get us to use his studio, but then Paul felt we might be somehow unduly influenced by the whole African thing happening there. Paul would sit around with an idea for a song and I'd learn it. Then I would play guitar and he'd look after the drums. Of course, Linda was taught her little bits as well. The beauty of that album, everybody says, is the feel. It proved Paul and I had a very sharp needle edge, a keen eye for what we wanted. The fact that it was just the 2 of us showed that we really didn't need anyone else, although I felt we should think about getting a band together to go back out on the road.
It was like a real fight to make that album. So from the start, the 2 of them didn't turn up.
Do you find that in your experience with Wings and the Beatles that if there is that kind of friction, that
unfortunately,
can it actually
unfortunately,
help the
it does
process?
help. Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing because who wants to go around having stress all the time just to help the creative?
Yeah.
But when it does happen, it does seem to actually help. I mean, it's a drag because it does. The logic then follows that we should all walk around even more stressed to make better albums. Which, I get to a point of thinking, who needs it? Hell, I'd rather not make albums than do that. But I think, unfortunately, it does help a bit that, and it did on that one. It gave us kind of really something to fight against. But we were kind of going uphill all the way. So the 2 guys didn't turn up, so I had to fill in there. But then I kind of thought, yeah, but wait a minute, I love playing drums. Haha, great. And the positive side started to creep in.
Troubling too was the interjection of popular native musician Fela Ransomed Kuti into Paul's African mix. A close friend of Ginger Baker's, Kuti met the former Fab following his high-energy set at a Lagos nightclub. The musically militant Nigerian immediately laid into the astonished Paul over his very presence in the country. Fearing the megastar might somehow spirit away the cultural essence of his people's music, he warned him not to attempt any undue exploitation of the exotic rhythms he found there. "Maybe you should just go back to England where you came from, man," Kuti remonstrated to the pop icon. "The people don't need you here." "Listen, mate," Paul retorted. "We've done okay without Africa so far. We're not here to rip anybody off." Thereafter, Paul and the self-appointed custodian of African musical culture formed a tenuous, if uneasy, friendship. In fact, Paul has always secretly admired those who have dared to stand up to him. He was apparently a kind of prince, says Denny. son of a chief of some tribe who had his own little set called Africa 70. He accused us of stealing his music, which is absolute bullshit. Talk about somebody who owns the rights to the world. If you like a piece of music and you go and sing it, that doesn't mean you're stealing it. Obviously, we were influenced. We were influenced everywhere we went in the world, but he wanted to cause trouble. Out of the adversity of Wings' African Safari was born what stands today as the group's finest album, Band on the Run. It encompasses the very best of Paul's solo work, both as a musician and a composer, heralding a deeply genuine partnership between himself and the vastly underrated Denny Laine. The album's 10 tracks represent a Paul McCartney unencumbered by the dictates of a career concentrated on generating hits, as opposed to simply making fine music. Even today, Paul admits that the skyrocketing Jet is one of his favorite Wings tracks. It was one of the few Wings songs he performed on his 1989-1990 world tour. Laine, on the other hand, is a little less sentimental about the triple platinum bestseller. All it meant to me was I made a little bit more money, and everybody was giving us gold albums, he reflected ruefully in 1989. Although, of course, I was happy we'd made a good record. The fall of 1973 saw the final semi-reunion of the Beatles when John, Paul, and George joined forces to help their old pal Ringo to boost his then dismal solo career by contributing to what would later become his popular Ringo album. Paul's offering, the syrupy Love Gone Wrong tune, 6 O'Clock, worked well within the narrow parameters of Ringo's vocal range, as did John's I'm the Greatest and George's 3, Sunshine Life for Me, You and Me Babe, and the hit single, Photograph.